Welcome to Life Story 999. Today's story revolves around Mr. Edward Lewis, an elderly gentleman who faces an unexpected confrontation with a young officer in a peaceful park, unaware that a hidden observer is watching. This incident serves as a powerful reminder of justice, dignity, and the strength of standing up for what is right. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more compelling stories. The sun had just begun to rise over Rosewood Park, painting the morning sky with hues of orange and pink. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a peaceful harmony that filled the air. The serenity of the park was interrupted only by the chirping of birds and the distant laughter of early morning joggers. On his favorite bench, Mr. Edward Lewis, a man well into his 70s, sat comfortably. He held a warm cup of coffee in one hand and a neatly folded newspaper in the other, enjoying the quiet start to his day. Edward cherished these moments. The park had been his refuge for years, a place where he could sit, reflect, and simply enjoy the simplicity of nature. His silver hair shimmered under the soft rays of sunlight, and his face, lined with years of experience, bore a gentle smile as he glanced over the headlines. It was his favorite routine, an escape from the hustle and bustle that had become all too familiar over the decades. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth that spread through him, a stark contrast to the crisp morning air. Unbeknownst to Edward, someone else was also there, watching. On a bench across the way, partially hidden beneath a large oak tree, Marcus Reed sat silently. Unlike Edward, Marcus wasn't there to enjoy the scenery or catch up on the news. Instead, he was observing, his eyes fixed on the scene before him, his demeanor calm but vigilant. Marcus had a quiet strength about him, a presence that made him blend and yet somehow stand out to those who paid attention. He watched as Edward turned the page of his newspaper, a look of contentment on his face. As the morning wore on, the golden sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the paved paths and neatly manicured lawns. Rosewood Park seemed to exist in its own world, a place untouched by the troubles of the city. There was a serenity that wrapped around it, as though time moved a little slower here, allowing those who visited a chance to catch their breath. Edward waved to a few familiar faces, fellow early risers who nodded and smiled as they passed by, their dogs in tow, or jogging shoes kicking up bits of gravel. The tranquility of the morning was soon interrupted. A young police officer, Tyler Griffin, walked into the park, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid. There was an air of authority about him, the kind that demanded attention. He scanned the park, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Edward. Griffin's steps were deliberate as he moved closer, his expression a mixture of suspicion and determination. Edward, still unaware, continued to enjoy his coffee, his attention momentarily captured by a sparrow that had landed near his feet. Marcus watched the young officer approach, his brow furrowing slightly. There was a tension that seemed to follow Tyler, something that contrasted sharply with the otherwise calm atmosphere of the park. Marcus's eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene, his body still, but his gaze sharp. As Tyler reached Edward's bench, the peaceful morning seemed to hang in suspension, the tranquility threatened by the officer's assertive presence. It was as if the park itself held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Officer Tyler Griffin eyed Mr. Edward Lewis from across the park, suspicion etched on his face. He strode forward with purpose, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached Edward's bench. Edward, still unaware, turned another page of his newspaper, enjoying the crisp morning air. The peace of Rosewood Park seemed to evaporate as Griffin's shadow loomed over Edward, casting a sense of unease on the scene. "Excuse me, sir," Griffin began, his voice carrying an edge that demanded attention. Edward looked up, startled at the sudden interruption. He blinked, his eyes meeting the officer's stern expression. "Can I help you, officer?" Edward asked politely, lowering his newspaper and taking a small sip of his coffee. Griffin's gaze was unwavering. "What are you doing here?" he asked, the suspicion in his tone unmistakable. Edward raised an eyebrow, clearly confused by the question. I'm just enjoying my morning coffee and reading the newspaper, like I do every day, he replied, his voice calm, though there was a hint of unease creeping in. Is there a problem? The officer's eyes narrowed, and he crossed his arms over his chest. This is a residential area. Do you live around here? He pressed. Edward nodded slowly, a small furrow appearing between his brows. Yes, I do. I've lived just a few blocks away for over 30 years. I come to this park every morning, he explained, his voice measured, trying to diffuse the tension. But Griffin wasn't satisfied. He shifted his stance, his posture becoming more rigid. Can you prove it? He demanded, his voice carrying an accusatory edge. The question hung heavily in the air, and Edward felt a tightness in his chest, a familiar feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. Prove it, Edward repeated, his tone incredulous. Officer, I've been coming here for decades. I know nearly everyone in this neighborhood. Griffin scoffed, his lips curling slightly. That's not what I asked, sir. If you can't prove you live here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, he stated firmly, his hand resting on his utility belt, the subtle movement not lost on Edward. The elderly man's heart began to beat faster, but he kept his voice steady. I assure you, I'm not causing any trouble. I'm just here to enjoy the park, like anyone else. But Griffin's demeanor only hardened. Listen, old man, I don't have time for games. If you can't prove you belong here, you need to move along, he said, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. Edward set his coffee cup down, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to reason with the young officer. Son, I think you're mistaken. I have every right to be here, Edward said, his voice carrying a quiet dignity. The word son seemed to ignite something in Griffin. His face flushed, and he took a step closer, looming over Edward. I'm not your son, he snapped, his voice dripping with irritation. And I'm telling you, you need to leave. Now, Edward could feel the tension radiating off the young officer, and he knew this wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. There was something deeper here, a prejudice that Edward had hoped was a thing of the past but knew all too well. Edward reached for his cane, his hand trembling as he pushed himself up from the bench. The stress of the confrontation was beginning to wear on him, and he could feel his chest tightening further. Officer, please. There's no need for this. I've lived here longer than you've probably been alive. I'm not loitering. I'm a resident, and I have every right to be here, he said, his voice strained but resolute. Griffin's patience had clearly run out. He grabbed Edward's arm roughly, yanking him forward. That's it. You're coming with me, he said, his voice cold. The sudden movement caused Edward to lose his balance, his cane clattering to the ground as he struggled to steady himself. Pain shot through his shoulder and he winced, his breathing becoming labored. Please, Edward gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I'm not resisting. I have a heart condition. Across the way, Marcus Reed had been watching the entire encounter unfold, his eyes narrowing as Griffin's behavior grew more aggressive. Marcus had remained still, assessing the situation, but as soon as he saw the officer grab Edward, something shifted. He stood up from his bench, his expression darkening. Marcus's presence was commanding, and as he approached, there was an unspoken authority about him. Stop! Marcus's voice rang out, clear and forceful, cutting through the escalating tension. Griffin froze, his grip still on Edward's arm as he turned to see who had spoken. His eyes widened as they landed on Marcus, recognition and a flicker of fear crossing his face. Chief Reed? Griffin stammered, his voice losing its edge. He quickly released Edward, stepping back as Marcus closed the distance between them. Marcus Reed, now standing directly in front of them, looked from Griffin to Edward, his eyes filled with both anger and concern. What exactly do you think you're doing, officer? Marcus demanded, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. Griffin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The authority that had fueled his actions moments ago had vanished, replaced by uncertainty. "Release him immediately," Marcus ordered, his gaze never leaving Griffin. The young officer obeyed, stepping back further as Marcus moved to support Edward, who was visibly shaken. "Are you all right, sir?" Marcus asked gently, his demeanor softening as he addressed Edward. Edward nodded, though his breathing was still labored. "I'll be fine, thank you," he managed, his eyes meeting Marcus's with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. Marcus turned his attention back to Griffin, his expression hardening once more. "This man is a respected member of this community. He's lived here for decades. And you," Marcus paused, his voice dripping with disappointment. "You're supposed to protect and serve, not harass and intimidate." Griffin's face turned a deep shade of red, and he looked down, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. "Report back to the station. We'll discuss this incident there," Marcus said firmly. Griffin nodded, his shoulders slumping as he turned and walked away, the weight of his actions apparent in his posture. Marcus watched him leave before turning back to Edward, offering a reassuring smile. "Let's get you back to your bench, Mr. Lewis," he said, guiding the elderly man carefully. The tension in the park began to dissipate, the peaceful morning slowly returning as Marcus helped Edward sit down once more. "Thank you, Chief Reed," Edward said, his voice still shaky but filled with gratitude. Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "No need to thank me, Mr. Lewis. It's people like you who make this community what it is. I'm just doing my job, ensuring everyone gets to enjoy it in peace." As they sat there, the sunlight once again filtered through the trees, and for a moment, it was as if the confrontation had never happened. The tranquility of Rosewood Park returned, but the lessons of that morning lingered, a reminder of the strength it takes to stand up for what is right. Just as Officer Griffin's hand began to move toward his handcuffs, Marcus Reed stood up from his bench, his gaze locked firmly on the scene unfolding before him. Marcus moved with a quiet authority, his presence immediately altering the dynamic of the situation. His tall frame and composed demeanor exuded an energy that was impossible to ignore. As he approached, the tension seemed to shift, and for a moment, it was as if time slowed down. "Stop!" Marcus's voice rang out, commanding and unyielding. The words sliced through the morning air, causing Griffin to freeze, his hand hovering near the handcuffs. The young officer turned, his expression of annoyance quickly replaced by one of surprise as he recognized who was approaching. The color drained from Griffin's face when he saw Marcus Reed, Chief Marcus Reed, the well-respected head of the city's police department. "Chief Reed?" Griffin stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. He quickly stepped back, his grip on Edward's arm loosening. Edward swayed slightly, regaining his balance as he glanced at Marcus, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and confusion. Marcus closed the distance between them, his eyes locked onto Griffin, his jaw set in a firm line. "What exactly do you think you're doing, officer?" Marcus demanded, his voice low but filled with barely restrained anger. Griffin opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The confidence he had worn so boldly just moments ago seemed to vanish under the intense scrutiny of his superior. He looked down, unable to hold Marcus's gaze. "Release him." "Now," Marcus ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Griffin immediately let go of Edward's arm, stepping back further, his hands dropping to his sides. Marcus turned to Edward, his expression softening. "Mr. Lewis, are you all right?" he asked gently, placing a steadying hand on the older man's shoulder. Edward nodded, though his breathing was labored, and he leaned heavily on his cane. "I'll be fine, Chief Reed." "Thank you," Edward managed, his voice shaky but grateful. He looked at Marcus with eyes that spoke of years of experience, of understanding the weight of these moments. Marcus gave him a reassuring nod before turning his attention back to Griffin, his expression hardening once more. "This man," Marcus began, his voice filled with a controlled fury, "is a respected member of this community. He has lived here for decades and contributed more to this neighborhood than you could even begin to understand. His words were deliberate, each one striking like a hammer. Griffin stood there, his face flushed, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. You are supposed to protect and serve, Marcus continued, his voice never rising, yet filled with a power that made Griffin shrink back. Not harass and intimidate. Do you understand that, Officer Griffin? There was a silence that hung heavily between them, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant sound of birds chirping. Griffin swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper as he answered, "Yes, Chief Reed." "Report back to the station," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "We will be having a conversation about this incident and your future with the department." Griffin nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He turned on his heel and walked away, his steps lacking the confidence they had held earlier. Marcus watched him until he disappeared from view, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Turning back to Edward, Marcus offered a gentle smile, his demeanor shifting from authoritative to caring in an instant. "Let's get you back to your bench, Mr. Lewis," he said, guiding the elderly man with a supportive arm. Edward nodded, his breath slowly returning to normal as he allowed Marcus to help him. They made their way back to the bench, the tension of the confrontation gradually dissipating, replaced once again by the calm of the park. As they reached the bench, Marcus helped Edward sit down, ensuring he was comfortable before taking a seat beside him. "I'm truly sorry you had to go through that, Mr. Lewis," Marcus said, his voice filled with genuine regret. "This isn't the kind of department I want to lead, and I promise you, there will be consequences for what happened today." Edward looked at Marcus, his eyes tired but appreciative. "Thank you, Chief Reed. It means a lot to have someone who understands," he said quietly. Marcus nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "We have a long way to go, but I assure you, things will change. People like you deserve to feel safe and respected in your own community." The sun continued its ascent, casting a warm glow over Rosewood Park. The tranquility slowly returned, and for a brief moment, it was as though the confrontation had never happened. But the lessons of that morning lingered, a reminder of the power of standing up for what is right and the importance of leadership that truly serves its people. As the sun continued its climb, Mr. Edward Lewis leaned back on the bench, his breathing finally steadying. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing his mind to drift back through the years. It was as if the park around him faded away, replaced by vivid memories of his younger days, days filled with both challenges and triumphs. Rosewood Park wasn't just any park to him. It was part of his life's work, a symbol of all he had fought for, and a testament to a vision he once dared to dream. Edward had grown up in an era where division was the norm, where people were separated not only by color, but also by invisible lines of prejudice and fear. The memories of his childhood came to him like flashes, walking past places he wasn't allowed to enter, seeing the eyes of his mother harden whenever she faced discrimination, and feeling the sting of being treated as less than by those who didn't even know him. But these experiences had not broken Edward. If anything, they had instilled in him a quiet resolve, a burning desire to change things for the better. He remembered the first time he had joined a community meeting, only 19 at the time, surrounded by elders who had spent their lives fighting for a better world. The room had been small, the air thick with the scent of coffee and determination. The discussions were passionate, often heated, as they debated how to make a real difference in their neighborhood. It was during one of those meetings that Edward first spoke up, his voice shaky but filled with purpose. He talked about the need for a place where people from all walks of life could come together, a space that could be shared by everyone, no matter their background. And that was where the seed for Rosewood Park had first been planted, in the hearts and minds of a small group of people who believed that unity was possible. It hadn't been easy. Edward worked tirelessly, attending countless city council meetings, often facing opposition from those who couldn't see beyond their biases. He remembered the long nights spent drafting proposals, trying to persuade the powers that be to see his vision. There were setbacks, many of them, But Edward was persistent. He knew that change didn't come without struggle, and he was willing to fight for it. He remembered the day the city finally approved the park's development. It had been a small victory, but to Edward, it felt monumental. He could still picture the faces of his fellow community members when he brought them the news. There had been tears, laughter, and a renewed sense of hope. The park wasn't just about green space. It was about creating a sense of belonging for everyone. A place where children could play together, where families could gather without fear, where people could see one another as neighbors rather than strangers. Edward had worked closely with the design team, ensuring that every aspect of the park reflected the community's spirit. The pathways were intentionally winding, encouraging people to slow down, to explore, to interact. Benches were placed under the shade of the oldest oak trees, inviting people to sit, to rest, to connect. Flowers of all colors were planted in neat beds, their vibrant blooms symbolizing the diversity that Edward cherished. And when the park finally opened, it was everything he had hoped it would be. The memory of that opening day was still clear in his mind. It had been a bright spring morning, much like today. The ribbon-cutting ceremony had drawn a crowd. Families, children, elders, all gathered to witness the beginning of something new. Edward remembered the laughter of the children as they ran across the grass, their voices mingling in a joyous symphony that seemed to wash away the past pains. People who had once avoided eye contact now smiled and greeted one another. The barriers that had divided them seemed, at least for that moment, to dissolve. He remembered standing off to the side, watching it all unfold, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. A local reporter had approached him, asking how he felt seeing his dream become a reality. Edward had paused, looking out at the people who filled the park, and said simply, "This is what hope looks like." Those words had made it into the paper the next day, and even now, decades later, people would occasionally remind him of them. But as the years passed, Edward knew that the fight for equality and unity was far from over. There were still moments, like today, that reminded him of how much work there was left to do. Moments that reminded him that prejudice, though diminished, had not disappeared. Yet, despite these challenges, Edward refused to be disheartened. He had seen progress, real progress, and he believed that as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there was always hope. His thoughts drifted to the younger generation, people like Marcus Reed. Marcus had been just a boy when Edward first met him, tagging along with his father to community meetings. Even then, Marcus had been sharp, observant, always asking questions. Edward had watched him grow, had seen the fire in his eyes whenever injustice was discussed. He had mentored Marcus, shared with him the lessons he had learned over the years, and watched with pride as Marcus joined the police force with the intention of making a difference from the inside. And now, here Marcus was, standing up for him, standing up for what was right. It filled Edward with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that the torch was being passed on. Edward opened his eyes, the present coming back into focus. The park was still bathed in the soft morning light, and Marcus was sitting beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Edward turned to him, a small smile playing on his lips. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I remember when this park was just an idea. Just a dream we talked about in the back of a community center." Marcus looked at him, his expression one of admiration and respect. "And now it's here," Marcus replied, "because of you, Mr. Lewis. Because you never gave up." Edward shook his head slightly. "Not just because of me. It was all of us, everyone who believed in it, who fought for it. And now it's your turn, Marcus, to keep fighting, to keep building. This park, this community, it's still a work in progress." Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening. "I won't let you down, Mr. Lewis. We'll keep pushing forward. For you, for everyone." Edward looked out at the park, at the children playing, at the families gathered, and felt a deep sense of peace. He had spent his life fighting for moments like this, for places like this, a place where people could come together, where differences could be set aside, even if just for a little while. He knew there would always be challenges, But he also knew there would always be people like Marcus, ready to meet those challenges head-on. The legacy of Rosewood Park wasn't just the trees or the benches or the flowers. It was the spirit of the people who came here, who made it their own, who continued to believe in a better future. And as Edward sat there, the warmth of the sun on his face, he knew that his work had mattered, that his life had made a difference. And for that, he was profoundly grateful. The day after the incident in Rosewood Park, Chief Marcus Reed sat in his office, his mind still occupied with the events that had unfolded. The way Officer Griffin had treated Mr. Edward Lewis had left a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't just a disrespect. It was a reminder of how much work still lay ahead for his department, for the community, and for himself as a leader. Chief Reed knew that change required more than words. It required action, and it required people like Mr. Lewis to help guide that change. That afternoon, Chief Reed decided to visit Mr. Lewis. He knew it wouldn't be enough to send a formal apology. He needed to speak to Edward face-to-face, to let him know that what had happened was not acceptable and would not be tolerated. He arrived at Mr. Lewis's modest home, a small bouquet of flowers in hand. Feeling the weight of what needed to be said, he knocked gently, and moments later, Edward opened the door, surprise registering on his face. "Chief Reed," Edward said, his voice warm but curious. "What brings you here?" "Mr. Lewis," Marcus began, his tone earnest, "I wanted to come by and apologize in person. What happened yesterday should never have happened, and I'm deeply sorry that it did. You deserve respect, not only as a community member, but as a person who has done so much for this neighborhood. My officers still have a lot to learn, and that's on me." He handed the flowers to Edward, who took them with a small smile. "Come in, Chief," Edward said, stepping aside to let Marcus enter. They moved to the living room, where Edward motioned for Marcus to sit. As they settled into their seats, the tension in the air slowly began to dissipate. Edward could see the sincerity in Marcus's eyes, and it meant more to him than any official statement ever could. "I appreciate you coming here, Marcus," Edward said, his voice gentle. "I know that the journey to real change isn't easy, but I have to admit, what happened yesterday, it took me back. It reminded me of all those years of struggle, of all the things we've tried to move past." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window where the sun filtered through the curtains. "We've come so far, but it's clear we still have work to do." Chief Reed nodded, his expression serious. "You're right, Mr. Lewis. We still have a long way to go, and I need your help to make that journey. Yesterday, I saw firsthand what it means to have a leader like you in our community. I want to ask if you'd be willing to come speak with my officers, to share your experiences, to help them understand what respect and community really mean. I think they need to hear your story, not just from a report, but from you." Edward was silent for a moment, considering the request. He knew how important this could be. He also knew how exhausting it could be to relive those memories, to share his pain and his hope over and over again. But then he thought of Marcus, of the way he had stepped in, of the way he had defended him without hesitation. He thought of the younger generation, the kids who played in Rosewood Park, who deserved a future free of prejudice. "I'll do it," Edward finally said, nodding. "But on one condition." Marcus leaned forward, listening intently. "I want to bring some of the local youth with me. They're the ones who need to be part of this conversation too. They're our future, and they need to understand how important it is to shape relationships between the community and the police. If I'm going to do this, I want them by my side." Marcus's face broke into a smile, a glimmer of hope lighting his eyes. "Absolutely, Mr. Lewis. I think that's an incredible idea. They need to be part of this, and I'd be honored to have them join us." He extended his hand, and Edward shook it firmly, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Together, they began to set a plan in motion. Chief Reed promised to arrange for a series of sessions at the station, where Edward could speak directly to the officers. They talked about how they could make the sessions impactful, how to create an environment where officers could not only listen but also engage, ask questions, and truly understand the implications of their actions. They envisioned bringing in local students, young leaders who had the potential to bridge gaps and foster trust. The following week, the first of those sessions took place. Edward stood before a room filled with uniformed officers, his eyes scanning the crowd. Marcus was beside him, and in the front row sat several young people from the community, high school students, local youth group members, all eager to be part of something bigger. Edward began by sharing his story, the same story that had shaped Rosewood Park, that had shaped his own journey. He spoke of the struggles, the triumphs, and the moments that had tested his resolve. He talked about the importance of respect that must be mutual, earned, and upheld by everyone in the community, including those tasked with protecting it. The room was silent as Edward spoke, his words resonating deeply. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet determination that commanded attention. He spoke of the role of the police not as enforcers, but as members of the community, as people who must build relationships based on trust and empathy. The young people beside Marcus shared their own experiences, of times when they felt safe and of times when they hadn't. They spoke of their hopes for a community where the police were seen as allies, not adversaries. Chief Reed watched as his officers listened, saw the expressions on their faces change as the stories sank in. He knew it wouldn't be an overnight transformation, but he could see the seeds being planted, the beginnings of a change he had long hoped to inspire. When the session ended, Edward looked over at Marcus, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. He had done what he could, and now it was up to them, to the officers, to the youth, to everyone present, to carry that torch forward. Marcus stepped up, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "This is just a start," he said. "We have a long road ahead, but today, we took an important step. We listened, we learned, and now it's time to act." Edward smiled, his heart swelling with hope. It was true. The road ahead was long, but he had faith. And as he looked at Marcus, at the young people who had stood up to share their voices, he knew that the future was in good hands. Mr. Edward Lewis stood in the community center, surrounded by a group of young people whose bright eyes and eager expressions filled him with hope. Among them were Maria, a college student studying social justice, and Eric, a local high school activist with a passion for making a difference. Edward had gathered these young leaders, knowing they were the future of the community. They were the ones who would help carry forward the vision he had fought for so many years ago. "Thank you all for being here today," Edward began, his voice steady as he looked at each of them in turn. "What we're doing here isn't just about talking. It's about making sure our voices are heard, about bridging the gap between the police and the community." Maria nodded, her eyes shining with determination. She had grown up in the neighborhood, witnessing both the struggles and the triumphs of her community, and was ready to play her part in shaping a better future. The next day, Edward, Maria, Eric, and several other young leaders made their way to the police station. The training room was filled with uniformed officers, including Chief Marcus Reed, who stood at the front, ready to introduce the guests. The young leaders felt a mix of nerves and determination as they took their seats, ready to share their stories. Edward gave Maria and Eric a reassuring nod, encouraging them to speak from the heart. Maria was the first to stand. She spoke of her experiences as a child, of the time she felt afraid to walk in her own neighborhood because of how she was perceived. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable strength behind her words. She spoke of her desire for change, not just for herself, but for her younger siblings, for the children who deserve to grow up without fear. "We need to see each other as people," she said, her gaze meeting that of several officers. "We need to understand that our lives are connected, that what happens to one of us affects all of us." Eric followed, his voice more raw, more impassioned. He spoke about an encounter he had had with law enforcement just a year prior, how he had been stopped while walking home, questioned without cause, made to feel like a suspect simply because of the way he looked. His words resonated with the officers, and Chief Reed watched as some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of Eric's story settling over them. As each young leader spoke, Edward could see the expressions on the officers' faces change. He saw the skepticism slowly give way to understanding, the defensiveness give way to empathy. These young people were not just sharing their experiences. They were opening a window into the lives of those the officers were sworn to protect. They spoke of hope, of the kind of community they wanted to build, where police officers were not feared but trusted, where mutual respect was a foundation of every interaction. Chief Reed stepped forward as the young leaders finished, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you all for sharing your stories," he said. "This is exactly what we need, real conversations, real understanding. It's not enough for us to just wear this uniform. We need to live up to what it represents. And that starts with listening to the people we serve." The room was quiet, but there was a sense of something shifting, something hopeful. As Edward looked around, he felt a swell of pride for Maria, for Eric, for every young person who had the courage to stand up and speak. They were planting the seeds for a better future. And he knew that those seeds would one day grow into something beautiful. The community had gathered, not just in that room, but in spirit, ready to take the next step towards true unity. A few days after the training session, Officer Tyler Griffin found himself standing at the door of Mr. Edward Lewis's home. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage before knocking. The experience in the training room had been transformative. Listening to Maria, Eric, and the others had opened his eyes in ways he hadn't expected. It was no longer enough to just feel regret. He needed to take action, and that started with an apology. The door opened, and Edward stood there, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Officer Griffin," he said, his voice calm but curious. Tyler nodded, his expression serious. "Mr. Lewis, I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment. If you're willing." Edward studied him for a moment, then stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. They moved to the living room, and Edward motioned for Tyler to sit. There was a moment of silence as Tyler struggled to find the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with sincerity. "Mr. Lewis, I wanted to come here today to apologize. I know that what I did in the park was wrong. I disrespected you, and I allowed my biases to cloud my judgment." Hearing those young people speak, it made me realize just how much harm I've caused, not just to you, but to others as well. Edward listened intently, his eyes never leaving Tyler's face. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet curiosity. "Go on," Edward said, his voice gentle. Tyler took another deep breath. "I've decided to leave the police force," he continued. "I know that might sound drastic, but I realize that this isn't where I can do the most good. I want to help people, and I think the best way I can do that now is by becoming a social worker. I want to be there for those who need support, for those who feel like they don't have a voice." Edward's eyes softened, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "That's quite a decision, Tyler," he said, using his first name for the first time. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong, and even more to change your path because of it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Redemption is possible, you know. It starts with taking responsibility, just like you're doing now, and it continues with the choices you make from here on out." Tyler's eyes glistened and he nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right. I want to make a difference, like you have." Edward reached out, placing a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Then go do it," he said simply. "You have the power to change lives, to make amends. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. There was no need for more words. Tyler had come seeking forgiveness, and while Edward could not erase the past, he could offer a path forward. It was up to Tyler now to walk it. As Tyler stood to leave, Edward walked him to the door. Before stepping outside, Tyler turned back, his expression earnest. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis, for everything." Edward nodded, his smile warm. "Take care of yourself, Tyler. And remember, every step towards change matters." As the door closed behind him, Tyler felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. This was his new beginning, a chance to make things right, to use his experiences to help others. And for the first time in a while, he felt hopeful. Edward watched him walk away, a sense of peace settling over him. People could change. It wasn't easy and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. And that, Edward thought, was worth believing in. A few years had passed since that pivotal day in Rosewood Park, and now the park was alive with the sounds of celebration. The community had gathered to honor Mr. Edward Lewis and his contributions to Rosewood Park, a place that had transformed from a simple green space into the vibrant heart of the neighborhood. Bright banners hung between the trees, and tables filled with food and drinks lined the walkways. Children ran across the grass, their laughter echoing through the park, and families spread out on picnic blankets, enjoying the day. It was a celebration of progress, unity, and the power of a shared vision. Edward stood near the fountain, the one that had become a symbol of hope and perseverance. His silver hair glistened in the sun, and his eyes sparkled with pride as he looked around at the people who had come together. People from all walks of life, all here because of a dream he had once dared to believe in. Beside him stood Chief Marcus Reed, his uniform crisp, though his hair had turned almost completely gray since the last time they had stood together in this park. Chief Reed was nearing retirement, but today he felt as youthful and hopeful as he had when he first joined the force. "Look at this, Edward," Marcus said, his voice filled with emotion. "This is what you've built. This is your legacy." Edward smiled, his gaze drifting to the young people who had gathered near the stage. Among them were Maria and Eric, his men who had grown into respected community leaders. Maria, now a social justice advocate working for a national nonprofit, stood confidently as she prepared to address the crowd. Eric, who had become a teacher and an activist, was beside her, a wide smile on his face. The mayor stepped up to the microphone, her voice carrying across the park as she welcomed everyone and spoke of the importance of community, of coming together to make a difference. She gestured towards Edward, calling him to the stage. The crowd erupted in applause as Edward made his way forward, his steps steady but measured. He reached the podium, looking out over the faces of friends, neighbors, and strangers who had become family over the years. "Thank you, everyone," Edward began, his voice strong despite his age. "When we first envisioned this park, it was never just about the grass and the trees. It was about creating a place where people could come together, a place where our differences didn't divide us, but instead made us stronger." He paused, his eyes finding Marcus in the crowd. "We've come a long way, but the journey isn't over. This park, this community, is still a work in progress. And that's a good thing. It means we still have the opportunity to grow, to learn, to become better." He gestured towards Maria and Eric, inviting them to join him on stage. As they stepped forward, Edward's heart swelled with pride. "These young leaders are the future," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "They are the ones who will carry this work forward, who will continue to fight for equality, for justice, for unity. And I couldn't be prouder of them." Maria took the microphone, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Mr. Lewis has been more than a mentor to me," she said, her voice steady. "He taught me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. He showed me that change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when we work together, when we refuse to give up." She smiled, her gaze meeting Edward's. "This park is a symbol of that belief. It's a reminder that progress is possible, that we can build something beautiful if we do it together." Eric stepped up next, his enthusiasm evident. "Growing up, I didn't always feel like I had a voice," he admitted. "But Mr. Lewis made me realize that my voice matters, that all of our voices matter. And now, as a teacher, I try to pass that lesson on to my students. I want them to know that they can make a difference, just like Mr. Lewis has." The crowd applauded and Eric nodded, his eyes shining with determination. Chief Reed watched from the side, his heart swelling with pride. He had seen firsthand the impact that Edward's work had made, not just on the community, but on the police force as well. The training sessions, the open dialogues, the willingness to listen and to change. It had all started with Edward's vision. And now, as he watched Maria, Eric, and the other young leaders speak, he knew that the future was in good hands. As the speeches concluded, the mayor returned to the stage, presenting Edward with a plaque in recognition of his contributions. The words engraved on it spoke of his dedication to unity, to equality, and to the betterment of the community. Edward accepted it with a humble smile, his eyes misting over as he looked out at the people who had gathered to celebrate not just his work, but the spirit of the community itself. After the formalities, the celebration continued with music, food, and laughter. Edward and Marcus found themselves sitting on one of the benches under the old oak tree, watching as children played near the fountain, their carefree joy a testament to everything they had worked for. "You know, Marcus," Edward said, his voice thoughtful, "I think the best part of all of this is knowing that it doesn't end here. It keeps going. These young people, they're going to do things we never even dreamed of." Marcus nodded, his eyes following a group of teenagers who were setting up a game of basketball. "You're right, Edward, and that's the beauty of it. We've laid the foundation, but they're the ones who are going to build on it, who are going to take it further than we ever could." He looked at Edward, his eyes filled with respect. "You've given them that chance. You've given all of us that chance." Edward smiled, a deep sense of peace washing over him. "It was never just me, Marcus. It was all of us. Everyone who believed in something better. Everyone who refused to give up." He paused, watching as Maria and Eric joined the teenagers at the basketball court, their laughter ringing out. And as long as there are people willing to stand up, to speak out, to care for one another, there will always be hope. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over Rosewood Park. The celebration continued, a testament to the progress that had been made and the promise of what was yet to come. Edward leaned back, his heart full. He knew that his work had mattered, that his life had made a difference. And as he watched the next generation carry the torch forward, he knew that the dream of unity and equality was alive and well, ready to grow and flourish in the hands of those who would come after him. Thank you for watching today's story on Life Story 999. Mr. Lewis's journey reminds us that every small action can contribute to a greater movement for justice and change. If his story moved you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more inspiring stories.